The archive is open. Come in out of the cold. Your chair is where you left it, the one by the lamp. Tonight I've pulled down the longest file on the shelf. Rome, the village, by a river crossing that argued its way into an empire. The whole 1,000-year story told slowly. You don't need to remember any of this. There's no test at the end. If you drift, I'll keep reading. Let's begin. Every great city starts somewhere ordinary, and Rome started at a crossing. Picture a stretch of river, the Tiber, running down through a soft landscape of hills and marsh toward the sea. Most of that river was too deep or too wide to wade across without trouble. But at one particular bend, the water ran shallow. A person with a cart or a flock of sheep or a sack of grain on their shoulder could simply walk through. That is not a small thing. In a world without bridges, a shallow crossing is a kind of gift, and gifts like that tend to gather people around them. Rising just above that crossing were hills, 7 of them by the old count that Romans themselves settled on later when they wanted a tidy number for a messy truth. The hills were not identical, not evenly spaced, not part of any plan. They were simply there, the way hills are, shaped by water and time long before anyone thought to name them. But they gave height above the marsh, dry ground to build on, and a view down to the river and the crossing below. And running past that crossing, older than any wall the city would ever raise, was a road. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road. It carried salt inland from flats near the coast, where seawater was left to dry in the sun until only white crystal remained. We forget, most nights, what salt meant to people with no refrigeration and a winter to survive. It preserved meat and fish, kept a family fed through the months when nothing grew. A road that carried salt was a road that carried survival, and it had been carrying it long before there was a Rome to carry it through. So think of the earliest version of this place not as a city, not yet, but as a convenience. A place where shepherds bringing flocks down from the hills met farmers working the river flats. A place where people crossed with their salt and their grain, and sometimes decided to stop rather than keep walking. They traded here. They argued here over pasture rights and boundary stones, and whose goat had wandered into whose field. And in time, they buried their dead here too, on the higher, drier ground, which is often how we know people lived somewhere at all. They left their departed behind, tucked into the earth, waiting quietly for us to find them. Now the Romans themselves, generations later, told a very different story about how all this began. Twin brothers, they said, abandoned as infants and suckled by a she-wolf on the riverbank, raised by a shepherd, growing into young men who quarreled, as brothers in stories so often do, over exactly where to build their wall. One brother mocked the other's wall as too low. There was a killing. There was a city named for the survivor. It is a good story. It has been told for roughly 2,500 years for a reason. It is short, it is strange, and it explains a founding with the clean drama that founding usually lacks. But we should hold it the way we hold a favorite bedtime story about our own family, fondly and as legend. As far as we can tell, that is exactly what it is, the story Romans told about themselves, not a record of what happened. What the ground itself tells us, when people dig carefully into it, is quieter and slower. Small huts on one hill, then huts on a neighboring hill, villages of mud and thatch and wattle, herding sheep, planting barley, burying their dead in simple graves, growing not by conquest, but by accumulation, one more hut, one more family, one more season. Over generations, those separate hilltop settlements crept toward each other, the gaps between them filling in, until what had been several small villages became, almost without anyone deciding it all at once, a single place with a single name. Imagine, if you like, standing on one of those early hills in the dark, looking down at cook fires scattered across the slopes around you, not a city yet, just neighbors, close enough now to hear each other's dogs bark at night. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Before Rome was Rome, there was a road for carrying salt. The city that would one day claim all roads led to it began as a convenient place to cross a river on the way to somewhere else, a shortcut that decided to stay. For the first few centuries of its life, Rome was ruled by kings. 7 of them, tradition says, one after another, and like the founding twins, their names and their deeds have drifted somewhere between memory and story. We cannot be entirely sure which of their achievements are fact and which are later polish, added by descendants who liked the idea of a well-organized beginning. But we can say, gently, what the kings seem to have actually left behind, because some of it is still there in the ground. They built walls, the first real ones, turning a cluster of hilltop villages into something that could be defended as a single place. And they built something perhaps less glamorous but more useful, a great channel dug and lined to drain the marshy valley that sat low between several of the hills. That valley had been mud and standing water, good for very little, not fit for building, not fit for farming, just a low, wet stretch that everyone had to walk around. Drained, it became dry, level, walkable ground, the ground that would one day become the forum, the open heart of the city, where Romans would gather for the rest of their history to trade, to gossip, to vote, and to argue. Before it could hold an empire's business, someone first had to dig a ditch to carry the water away. Whoever ordered that channel dug was thinking about drier feet on a market day, not about the centuries of speeches that ground would one day carry. Credit where it's due, the kings gave Rome its bones. But the story Romans told about how kingship ended is not one of gratitude. It is a story about arrogance, and it centers on the last king in that line of 7, a ruler who is remembered, again, more as legend than as documented fact, as having grown so overbearing, so contemptuous of the people beneath him, that the city finally had enough. About 2,500 years ago, by the traditional reckoning, Rome rose up and drove that king out entirely, along with his whole family. No exile with dignity, no quiet retirement. Expulsion. And here is the part that matters far more than any single king's personality. Having done it once, the Romans swore they would never do it again. Never again, they said, would one man hold that kind of power in Rome. Never again a king. It is worth sitting with how strange that oath is and how long it held. Centuries of Roman history followed, wars, plagues, famines, ambitious men doing ambitious things, and through nearly all of it, the taboo survived. The word for king, rex, did not fade quietly into ordinary vocabulary the way old, unused words often do, forgotten on a shelf. It curdled instead. It became something closer to a curse, a word you flung at a rival to accuse him of wanting too much, rather than a title anyone respectable would claim for himself. Say it about a man in the forum, and you were not describing his job. You were naming his crime. Later, when individual men in Rome did gather enormous power into their own hands, and some of them gathered a great deal, enough to command armies, enough to silence the Senate, enough to be, In every practical sense, sole rulers of everything, not one of them called himself king. They reached instead for other words. Borrowed titles, invented titles, old religious titles repurposed for new ambition, anything at all, so long as it was not Rex. Imagine, if you like, an entire civilization organizing its language around one word it refused to say out loud, the way a family might simply stop mentioning a name at dinner. That is the strange gift the expelled king left behind, without meaning to. Not a lesson about virtue, necessarily. Rome would prove plenty capable of harsh rule under other names, but a permanent, load-bearing suspicion of the word itself. A grudge with remarkable staying power. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. The word Rex stayed so poisonous in Rome that centuries later, men who ruled exactly as kings in everything but name would accept any honor, any office, any invented title in the world, except that one. A whole empire organized around not saying one word. With the kings gone and the oath sworn, Rome faced a practical matter that no amount of vowing could settle by itself. If not a king, then something else entirely had to fill that space. What the Romans built in answer is worth walking through slowly, because it is, in its own patient way, a small marvel, a machine assembled almost entirely out of mutual distrust, and built to run on argument rather than obedience. At the top, where a king had stood alone, they placed two men, two consuls elected together, each holding the full power a king once held: command of armies, control of public business, the weight of the highest office in the city. But here is the design, and it is a clever one. Either consul could act, and either consul could stop the other from acting. Full power doubled and set against itself. No single man could drift into being king by accident, by ambition, or by simple accumulation of favors over time, because there was always a second man standing beside him with equal authority and every incentive to say no. And even that doubled power came with an expiration date stamped directly onto it: 1 year. A consul served his term, and then he stepped down, and the office passed to someone else. Power in Rome was never meant to settle into anyone's hands long enough to grow comfortable there. Below the consuls, and in truth doing a great deal of the real governing, sat the Senate, several hundred elder men, drawn mostly from the old established families, gathered in a plain hall to talk things through. Officially, the Senate only advised. It could not pass laws on its own, could not command armies directly, could not do many of the things we might associate with real power. And yet, in practice, almost nothing of importance happened in Rome without the Senate's blessing first being argued into existence, sentence by sentence, in that hall. Advice, it turned out, could function very much like command if enough respected men agreed to give the same advice together. Beneath the Senate stood the citizen assemblies, ordinary Roman men, gathered by voice and by vote, who elected the officials and who voted directly on the laws those officials proposed. However imperfect and unevenly weighted these assemblies were in practice, and they were both of those things, the principle stood. Even the loftiest office in Rome answered, eventually, to a crowd of citizens standing in the open air and saying yes or no. And running through the whole structure was one more quiet rule that shaped everything. Public office in Rome paid no salary. A consul, a senator, any magistrate at all, served without wages. The reward was honor, pure reputation, the kind of wealth that could not be spent, but could be displayed, inherited, and fiercely defended. Romans kept score in honor the way merchants kept score in coin, in careful ledgers of who had held which office, who had won which battle, whose family name carried the most weight when spoken aloud in the forum. Taken all together, it was, frankly, an inefficient way to run a city, two men who could cancel each other, a council that only advised but somehow decided everything, a citizenry that had to be persuaded rather than simply commanded, terms that expired before ambition could properly ripen. It looked, from the outside, very much like chaos, endless meetings, endless speeches, endless compromise. But that inefficiency was not an accident. Rome preferred slow argument to quick obedience, on purpose, because slow argument was harder for any one man to seize and turn into a throne. And this deliberately clumsy machine, built by people who trusted process more than they trusted any single person, held together and governed the city for roughly 500 years. Imagine, if you like, a whole civilization deciding, quite reasonably, that speed was less important than making sure no one person ever again held all the reins at once. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. The two consuls even took turns at precedence, month by month, supreme command handed back and forth like a shared tool that neither man was allowed to keep. Rome trusted its highest office to work only if two hands were always on it. The government of consuls and senate that Rome built after its kings was clever, but it was not fair, not evenly, and the unfairness ran along a very old line. On one side stood the patricians, the established old families, the ones who filled the Senate and won the consulships, and had, generation after generation, first claim on the honor that Roman public life was built to hand out. On the other side stood everyone else, the plebeians, or plebs for short, farmers who worked small plots and prayed for good rain, soldiers who marched out to fight Rome's wars and came home, if they came home, to debts that had not paused while they were away. Craftsmen, laborers, the great ordinary bulk of the city. Most of Rome, in plain fact, was plebeian. For years, the arrangement held, unevenly but tolerably. Then it stopped holding. Debt weighed on plebeian families with a particular cruelty, a bad harvest, a war that pulled a farmer away from his own fields at exactly the wrong season. And suddenly, a man could find himself owing more than he could ever repay, with punishments for debt in early Rome that were harsh enough to be frightening even to speak of. Rights that patricians took for granted, plebeians simply did not have. Pushed far enough, something had to give. What the plebeians did next had, as far as anyone can tell, no real precedent. They did not riot. They did not storm the Senate House or turn on their patrician neighbors with violence. Instead, they walked out, simply left the city, gathered themselves and their families, and withdrew to a hill outside the walls, and there they stopped farming Rome's fields, stopped working Rome's trades, stopped, most critically of all, serving in Rome's army at a moment when Rome, like most cities of its age, could not afford to go without one. It is, as near as history records, the first general strike anyone ever staged, an entire class of a city's population declining all at once to participate any further until the terms changed. And it worked. A city with no farmers, no craftsmen, and no soldiers is a city that cannot function, no matter how honorably its Senate debates matters in that plain hall of theirs. The patricians negotiated. The plebeians came home. The settlement that brought them back created something entirely new in Rome's government, the tribunes of the plebs. These were officials elected by the plebeians alone, to represent the plebeians alone, and they came with two extraordinary protections built in. First, a tribune's person was sacrosanct, untouchable by law, so that no patrician official could arrest him, harm him, or obstruct him in the course of his duty without committing a crime against the city itself. Second, and this is the part worth turning over slowly in your mind, a tribune held the power to stop any single act of government, any law, any decree, any decision by any consul, simply by speaking one word aloud. Veto, Latin for I forbid. One man, standing for people who owned no land and held no office and commanded no army, could say that single word, and the machinery of the entire city halted exactly where it stood, whether the Senate liked it or not. This was not the only walkout. Over the generations that followed, the plebeians would leave the city again more than once, whenever the argument between the two classes reached another breaking point, and each time they returned, they came home holding another piece of what they had gone out to win: access to more offices, protection under written law rather than unwritten custom that patricians could bend at will. Slowly, stubbornly, one withdrawal at a time, the argument tilted, if never quite fully, toward balance. Imagine, if you like, the quiet of that first hillside outside the walls, thousands of people, simply waiting, saying nothing more than that they would not come back until the terms were fair. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Veto, 2 syllables, I forbid, spoken by one tribune on behalf of the people, and the machinery of the mightiest city in Italy stopped where it stood. The word has never retired. It is still stopping laws in senates and councils around the world tonight. For as long as the tribunes had argued on behalf of the plebeians, one grievance kept surfacing beneath all the others. It was about where the law actually lived. Until now, the law of Rome lived nowhere you could point to. It lived in the memories of a small circle of patrician judges, passed down the way a family recipe is passed down, by word, by habit, by trust, that the person reciting it was reciting it honestly. And memory, conveniently for whoever holds it, tends to remember things the way power finds most useful. A plebeian standing before a judge had no tablet to check, no scroll to consult, nothing but the judge's own word for what the law required. If a ruling seemed to shift from one case to the next, there was no way to prove it, nothing written down to compare it against. So the demand, when it finally came, was almost brutally simple. Write it down, all of it. Put the law somewhere a person could stand in front of it and read. Rome answered, eventually, in bronze and stone. A body of men was appointed to gather the city's laws, customs, and procedures, and carve them onto a set of tablets, 12 in total, then set them up in the Forum, the open public square at the heart of the city, where anyone with eyes and a little patience could walk up and read them for themselves. The 12 tables, they came to be called, and for the ordinary person going about ordinary business, they changed the shape of the world overnight, without a single building falling down or a single battle being fought. What is almost more striking than the table's existence is how unglamorous their contents turned out to be. These were not lofty pronouncements about liberty or the soul of the city. They were the small physics of living beside other people, where your property ends and your neighbor's begins, and what happens when a boundary marker gets knocked over? What happens when your neighbor's cow wanders into your field of grain and eats half of it before anyone notices? How debts are to be repaid, and what a creditor may and may not do to a debtor who cannot pay. How an estate is divided when someone dies, and who inherits what, and in what order. How a trial is to proceed, how many days a case may run, how a judgment is enforced once it is reached. It reads in places like the minutes of a very long argument between neighbors, which, in a sense, is exactly what it was. But that ordinariness was the entire point. A law about wandering livestock is not a grand statement about justice. It is a tool a farmer can actually use, arguing with the farmer next door. Grand pronouncements tend to serve people already comfortable enough to make them. Rules about fences and debts and inheritance serve everyone who owns a fence or owes a debt or will someday not be there to divide up what they leave behind, which is, eventually, all of us. The tables did not end unfairness in Rome, but they made it harder to hide. A ruling that contradicts what is carved in the forum can be challenged by anyone who has learned to read it, and the tables took the law out of the judges' heads and put it somewhere every future generation could check the current one's work against. Check it they did for centuries. Long after the bronze itself had worn thin or been lost to fire and time, Roman schoolboys still memorized the 12 tables by heart, reciting them the way children elsewhere recited prayers, because that had simply become what an educated Roman knew, part of belonging to a city with a particular habit of settling arguments by carving the settlement down where no one could quietly move it later. Imagine, if you like, a boy in a Roman schoolroom decades afterward, chalk dust on his fingers, reciting a rule about a fence line word for word, without ever having seen a fence in his life, simply because that was what Rome had decided its children ought to carry with them. That is the real argument the tables settled underneath the rulings about cattle and coin. Law you can point at is a different thing from law you must take someone's word for. One can be checked, the other can only be trusted, and trust is a much scarcer thing than bronze. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Among the 12 tables' solemn rulings on property lines and unpaid debts sits a stranger sort of rule, limits on how loudly and how extravagantly a household might mourn its dead at a funeral. Rome, a city already fond of drama and display, found it necessary very early on to legislate the volume of its own grief. Set aside, for a while, the senators and the generals and the great arguments carved into bronze. Tonight, let's simply spend one morning at street level, in a city waking up the way cities wake up, slowly, then all at once. Most Romans did not sleep in villas with gardens and painted walls. They slept in insulae, tall apartment blocks, several floors stacked one above another, shops occupying the ground level where the street traffic and noise were thickest. The higher you climbed, the cheaper the rent, the thinner the walls, and the more likely the roof was to leak just above your head. A family on the top floor woke to whatever weather the night had brought, felt through the ceiling before it was ever seen through a window. But everyone, high floor or low, woke to the same city stirring around them, and the very first thing that city did each morning was renew a promise it had made the day before. At first light, the streets around a wealthy or influential household began to fill. This was the salutatio, the morning greeting, and it worked something like this. Men who depended on a patron, a more powerful figure who looked after their interests, arrived at that patron's door to pay their respects. They asked for favors, reported news, offered support, and often left with something practical tucked under an arm: a loaf of bread, a handful of coin, a promise of help with some matter still unresolved. Multiply that single doorway by every doorway in Rome belonging to anyone with anything to offer, and you have a city quietly renewing its entire social fabric before breakfast. Speaking of breakfast, it was usually already waiting, warm, a few streets away. Most apartment rooms had no kitchen at all, because an open flame in a wooden building stacked several floors high was a genuinely dangerous idea, and Rome had learned that lesson the hard way more than once. So bread was bought, not baked, from bakeries that had been working since well before dawn, their ovens already hot, the smell curling into the street to meet anyone walking past half awake. Water, too, was fetched rather than found at home. Public fountains stood at intervals through the neighborhoods, fed by the long aqueducts that carried water in from the hills outside the city, and every morning brought a small crowd there with jugs balanced on hips or shoulders. It was work, filling a jug and carrying it home, but it was also, unavoidably, a gathering, the kind of daily errand that turns into conversation whether you intended it to or not. News traveled at the fountain. So did complaints and jokes and the sort of gossip that every neighborhood runs on. A little further along, you might pass a school with no building of its own at all, simply an awning stretched across a street corner for shade, a teacher standing before a small huddle of children seated on stools, wax tablets balanced on their knees, a stylus in each hand for scratching out letters that could then be smoothed flat and used again. Learning, like breakfast, mostly happened in public, within arm's reach of the ordinary business of the street. And the street itself was waking too. Wooden shutters clattered up along shop fronts, one after another, opening onto counters stacked with pottery, tools, cloth, whatever a given shop specialized in selling. Carts began to move, voices rose. The city that had been quiet an hour before was, by mid-morning, thoroughly, cheerfully loud. Look closely at the walls themselves, and you find one more layer of that morning conversation, this one left behind from the night before and every night before that. Romans wrote on their own city constantly, election slogans urging a vote for one candidate or another, advertisements for a shop or a gladiatorial show, scraps of poetry, complaints about a neighbor, simple greetings scratched into plaster by someone passing through. A wall in a Roman street held about as much conversation as a wall can hold, layer upon layer, the way we now leave our own comments scattered across whatever surface offers itself. Imagine, if you like, standing at the base of one such wall in the cool hour just after sunrise, bread still warm in your hand, reading yesterday's scrawled jokes and complaints, while the street fills in around you, entirely unaware that you are standing in the middle of what later centuries would call an ordinary morning in ancient Rome. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. On a wall in the Roman town of Pompeii, someone once scratched a line that survives to this day, roughly translated as, "I am amazed, wall, that you have not collapsed under the weight of so much scribbling." A complaint about too many comments left behind in the comments some 2,000 years before anyone had heard of the internet. Every civilization argues for the things it believes in. Some argue with words in a forum or a court. Rome, true to its habits, also learned to argue in stone, and nowhere more thoroughly than in its roads. A Roman road was not simply a path worn flat by enough feet passing over it. It was engineered, deliberately, the way a wall is engineered, except laid on its side and stretched for hundreds of miles. Builders dug down first, below where any foot would ever land, and set foundations of packed stone and gravel in layers, each one compacted before the next went on top. Above that, a paved surface, gently curved from center to edge, so rainwater ran off into ditches dug alongside rather than pooling and softening the road from underneath. A road that floods is a road that fails, and Rome built as though it expected its roads to outlast the people who built them. And then there was the straightness, the thing that still catches the eye of anyone tracing an old Roman road on a map. Rome's surveyors worked with simple instruments, little more than sighting rods, plumb lines, and a great deal of patient measuring, but what they lacked in equipment they made up for in stubbornness. A hill in the way was not generally something to be walked around. It was something to be cut through or built over, because the straight line had already been decided upon. Milestones stood at intervals along the way, carved with the distance back to Rome itself, so a traveler anywhere in the network always knew, quite literally, how far they stood from the center of things. The first roads were built for one purpose above all others, to move the legions, an army that can march from one end of a growing territory to the other in half the usual time, can answer trouble before it grows into a crisis. Speed was the whole point at first. A road that let soldiers arrive twice as fast let Rome argue, in the end, half as long, because a dispute rarely escalates once everyone involved can see how quickly Rome is capable of showing up. But roads built for soldiers do not stay roads for soldiers only, not for long. The moment a route existed, paved and drained, and reliably passable in most weather, everyone else began using it too. Messengers carried orders and news at a gallop, covering distances in days that once took weeks. Merchants moved along the same stone with carts of olive oil, wine, grain, pottery, anything sellable at the far end for more than it cost at the near end. Ideas moved along it as well, and gossip, and rumors of war, and news of a new law carved into bronze back in the Forum, all of it traveling the same stone the legions had first marched down. There is an old saying that all roads lead to Rome, and it is worth pausing on how literally that began as true. The roads did not simply happen to pass near the city. They were laid out, quite deliberately, radiating outward from it, milestone by milestone, so that a person standing at any crossroads in the network could, in principle, follow the stone all the way back to the Forum without ever losing the way. The saying started as something close to a description of the map itself, before it ever became a figure of speech. Imagine, if you like, standing at a wide stone crossroads somewhere on the edge of the growing territory, watching a cart loaded with jars of oil pass one way and a courier on horseback pass the other, both of them relying on the same packed layers of gravel and stone beneath their feet, laid down years before by men who never expected to meet either traveler. The whole argument of Rome, its laws, its orders, its bread, its news depended, in the end, on being able to travel. Rome had settled its disputes in the Forum and carved its settlements into the 12 tables, but none of that mattered very far from the city unless the settlement itself could get there. The roads were how an argument, once won, was carried outward and made to hold. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Stretches of Roman road still carry traffic today, 2,000 years and countless generations of feet and wheels later, and in some of the old paving stones, you can still make out twin ruts worn into the surface, the grooves left by cart wheels, the quiet evidence of 20 centuries of perfectly ordinary errands. Across the sea from a growing Rome sat another great city, older in some ways, and for a long while considerably richer. Carthage, Carthage, had built its wealth on the water long before Rome thought to leave the shore at all. Its sailors knew the currents and coastlines of the whole western sea the way a farmer knows the fields around his own house, and its trading ships carried goods between ports that Rome had barely heard of. Two proud cities, sharing one sea between them, were bound eventually to find themselves in each other's way. And so began a long rivalry, stretched over roughly a century, flaring into open war and settling again into uneasy peace, then flaring once more. Rome came to this rivalry at a disadvantage. It had built its strength on land, on legions marching down straight roads, and it barely knew how to sail. A city that could engineer a road through the heart of a mountain had almost no experience keeping a ship afloat, let alone fighting a battle on one. Rome's solution to that gap was entirely characteristic. When a Carthaginian warship wrecked in a storm and washed ashore along the Italian coast, Rome did not despair at its own lack of a navy. It measured the wreck, plank by plank, and copied it, then copied the copy again and again, until an entire fleet existed where none had before, built from the traced outline of a rival's own vessel. Homework borrowed rather than invented, with one Roman improvement added: a hinged boarding bridge that could drop from a Roman ship onto an enemy deck, turning a sea battle, as much as the waves allowed, into the kind of close, disciplined land fight Roman soldiers already knew how to win. The rivalry's most remarkable turn, though, came not from Rome but from Carthage, and from one of its generals, Hannibal, whose name has outlasted nearly everything else about that century of conflict. Hannibal set out to reach Italy not by the sea that Rome now contested, but from the land side entirely, which meant crossing the Alps in winter, with an army that included war elephants, animals raised for the warmer climates of Africa, entirely unsuited on paper to a mountain crossing in snow. It should not have worked. Mountain passes are narrow, cold, and unforgiving even for soldiers on foot, let alone for elephants, which need enormous amounts of food and struggle on ice and steep ground. And yet the army came through, slower than planned, thinned by the crossing, but through. Mountain villagers who had never seen an elephant in their lives stood at the edges of the high passes and watched them pass by, single file, breath steaming in the cold air. Once in Italy, Hannibal proved as formidable on the field as he had been in the mountains, winning battle after battle against Roman armies for years on end. By any ordinary reckoning, a run of victories like that should have ended the war outright. But Rome did not consider a lost battle the same thing as a lost war. It simply refused to agree that it had lost, raised new armies to replace the ones that had fallen, absorbed each defeat without surrendering the argument, and endured, which turned out, over years rather than seasons, to be its own kind of strength, quieter than a victory, but just as decisive. Rome eventually carried the fight across the sea itself, to Africa, to the ground nearer Carthage's own home, and there, at last, the long rivalry tipped in Rome's favor for good. A generation later, After a final war between the two cities, Carthage was destroyed. It is a heavy sentence, and it deserves to be left exactly that plain tonight. What Rome carried forward from those decades of rivalry was less a lesson about any single battle and more a confirmation of something it had already begun to suspect about itself: that it could absorb almost any defeat, given enough will to keep raising new armies, and that endurance, patiently applied, could outlast even brilliance on the other side of the field. And there was one further, quieter inheritance: the sea itself, once entirely foreign to Rome, now belonged to its argument too, alongside the roads and the laws and the legions that had always been more naturally its own. Imagine, if you like, a Roman shipwright walking the length of a wrecked and salt-worn hull on some quiet beach, measuring it board by board in the grey morning light, with no way of knowing what that one careful measurement would eventually decide. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Rome's first real navy began as a tracing. One enemy warship, wrecked and washed ashore, was measured plank by plank and copied 100 times over. The empire that would become famous for its roads learned the sea by borrowing someone else's homework and never gave it back. Success, it turns out, can break the very machine that produced it. For centuries, Rome's wars had been fought by farmer soldiers, men who picked up a shield in spring, marched to some nearby campaign, and came home by autumn in time for the harvest. War was a season, then it stopped being one. As Rome's conquests reached farther, across the sea, over mountains, into lands that took months just to walk to, a campaign could no longer fit inside a single year. Fields that had been a morning's walk from the fighting were now impossibly distant. A farmer called away for one summer might find himself gone for 5 or 10, with no crop, no harvest, and eventually no farm to return to at all. So the army changed shape, quietly, the way most large changes happen, not by decree, but by necessity, finding the path of least resistance. Generals, needing men who could serve for years rather than a season, began doing something new. They paid their soldiers directly. They fed them, equipped them, and when the long campaigns finally ended, arranged land and pensions for them afterward, often from their own resources or their own influence, rather than waiting for the Senate back in Rome to get around to it. It was practical. It solved a real problem. And it planted something that would take decades to fully bloom. A soldier's loyalty tends to follow whoever actually pays him, feeds him, and remembers him when the fighting is done. Here is the quiet legal hinge the whole story turns on. For generations, a Roman soldier swore his oath to the Republic itself, to Rome, to the Senate and its people, an abstraction larger than any single man. But as armies became careers, and careers became tied to particular generals who recruited, paid, and led the same men for years running, the oath began, soldier by soldier, camp by camp, to name someone else. Not the Republic, a general, a person standing right there, whose face you knew and whose promises you'd watched him keep. Nothing looked different the next morning. Same camps, same black bread and hard biscuit, same worn leather sandals lined up outside the tents. No bell rang to mark the change. But everything that followed in Rome's long century of crisis follows from that one substituted word, republic to man, repeated eventually by tens of thousands of soldiers who had simply, reasonably, sworn loyalty to whoever they actually served. Underneath the army question sat an older, plainer one: land. Rome's conquests brought enormous wealth home, but that wealth did not spread evenly. Wealthy families bought up small farms, consolidated them into vast estates worked by enslaved labor, while the farmer soldiers who had done the actual conquering came home from their campaigns to find no farm left to come home to. A landless veteran with nowhere to go and nothing to do is not, historically, a stable ingredient in any society. Two brothers rose to ask the land question out loud, plainly in public, in front of the Senate. Their name was Gracchus, the Gracchi, as history remembers them together, and each, in turn, proposed giving Rome's poor and its veterans a fairer share of the public land. It ended badly for both of them, within a dozen years of each other, at the hands of their own political enemies. After the Gracchi, the argument did not stop. It only grew rougher. A series of strongmen, men with loyal, paid, personally devoted armies behind them, began taking turns holding the city, sometimes by election, sometimes by simply marching in and daring anyone to object. Each turn looked a little less like the old give-and-take of debate in the Senate, and a little more like one man's will, temporarily wearing the Republic's clothes. Imagine, if you like, an old soldier standing at the edge of a camp at dusk, saying the words of his oath aloud for the 100th time, not noticing, because there was nothing to notice, that the name in his mouth had quietly changed. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. The Republic's turning point hid inside an oath. For centuries, a soldier swore himself to the Republic. Then, quietly, soldier by soldier, the oath began naming a man instead. No law announced it. No bell rang. Just one changed word, repeated by thousands of voices, and the road afterward ran somewhere new. The most famous Roman of them all can be told calmly, without any of the noise later centuries piled onto his name. His years commanding in Gaul, in what is now France and its surrounding lands, made him three things at once. Famous, because his campaigns were reported back to Rome in his own vivid dispatches, read aloud in the Forum. Rich, from the wealth that long campaigns generated. And beloved by an army that had followed him for years, through winters and rivers and sieges, and had come, in the way soldiers do, to trust his face and his voice more than any distant senate they had never met. The law on this point was entirely clear and had been for a long time. A general was permitted to command an army in the provinces. He was not permitted to bring that army into Italy itself. Crossing that line with troops under his command was, by definition, an act of war against the Republic, treason, plainly named as such. And the line, in this particular case, was not some grand mountain range or a wide, obvious frontier. It was a small river in the north of Italy, modest enough that a person could walk from one bank to the other without much trouble, called the Rubicon. The story goes that he paused there on the bank for some time, weighing what crossing would mean, and that when he finally decided, he said a gambler's phrase, "The die is cast," the kind of thing said by a man who has just committed to a wager he cannot take back. Then he crossed, with his soldiers behind him, and Rome had its civil war. He won it, and having won, he did something no one in the Republic's long history had quite done before. He accepted the ancient office of dictator, a real, legal Roman title, but one meant for emergencies only, granted for a matter of months at a time, to be handed back the moment the crisis passed. He took it not for months. He took it dictator perpetuo, dictator without end. This is where Rome's oldest allegory met its newest reality. From its founding, Rome had defined itself against the idea of a king, had built its entire republic 500 years earlier on the memory of throwing one out and swearing never to have another. Now here was a man holding, in practice, more power than any king the old stories remembered, wearing a different word for it, but a king's shape all the same. On the Ides of March, in the very meeting hall where the Senate conducted its business, he was killed by a group of senators who believed, as far as we can tell, that they were saving the Republic by doing it. That is the event, stated plainly, without embellishment it does not need. What matters more is what came after. The Republic they believed they were saving did not come back. His death did not restore the old system. It only opened the final chapter of its ending. And then came the strangest afterlife any name has had in the history of politics. His family name, Caesar, did not simply fade into memory, it became a title. Future rulers of Rome would take it as their own, generation after generation, until the word itself came to mean supreme ruler, full stop. That title then traveled, by inheritance and translation, into languages he never spoke a word of, surfacing centuries later as Kaiser in German lands, and as Tsar among the Slavic peoples, both titles for supreme rulers, both descended from one Roman family name, carried for nearly 2,000 years after the man who first bore it was gone. Imagine, if you like, the sound of a river at night, no wider than a country road, utterly unremarkable to anyone who had not been told what standing on its far bank would mean. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. The Rubicon was so small that historians still are not certain which stream it actually was. The most consequential river crossing in Western history, the line between Republic and Empire, may have been a creek you could wade across without wetting your knees. The size of the line was never the point. Everyone simply agreed the line was there. The heir who finally ended a century of strain did it not with a sword in the end, but by mastering appearances. Octavian, the young man who would later be known as Augustus, won the last of Rome's civil wars, the final round in a long argument the Republic had been having with itself since long before he was born. He had watched that argument up close. He had watched what it cost. And so, with the whole city his to command outright, with no rival left standing and no army to answer to but his own, he did something almost no one expected of a man who had just finished winning everything. He announced that the Republic was restored. The Senate met again, as it always had. Consuls were elected, as they always had been. Every old office kept its old name, its old ceremony, its old seat, and men still rose to speak in the old chamber, as though nothing about the world had shifted beneath their feet. From the outside, wearing its old costume, the Republic looked, for all the world, like it had simply come back from a long illness, thinner, perhaps, a little more careful in how it walked, but recognizably itself. Underneath that costume, he quietly held every lever of power that actually mattered. The loyalty of the armies, the control of the treasury. The final word on nearly every important question, offered so gently it rarely needed to be spoken twice. All of it his, while the Senate kept its dignity, its meetings, and its sense of itself entirely intact. For his own title, he chose a careful, modest word. Princeps, first citizen, not king, never king, that old Roman allegory, running back 500 years to the founding, was honored to the letter, even as its spirit quietly went to sleep in the next room. He would be in name simply the first among equals, a fellow citizen who happened to be listened to a little more closely than the rest. In practice, there were no equals, and everyone in the city understood the difference perfectly well without anyone needing to say so aloud. And in exchange for that arrangement, after 100 years of civil war, land crises, assassinations, and armies marching on their own capital, as though the city belonged to whichever general reached it first, Rome received something it had nearly forgotten how to have: peace. Ordinary, unremarkable peace, the kind where a farmer could plant a field and reasonably expect to be the one who harvested it. Something like 2 centuries of that peace would follow, beginning here, with one household quietly running what the Republic, argue as it might, could no longer hold together on its own. He rebuilt the city itself to match the calm he was imposing on it. His own boast, recorded afterward by Roman writers, was that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, a line simple enough to remember and by most accounts close enough to true. Temples, forums, entire districts, redone in stone, meant to outlast the men who paid for it. Streets that had been mud in wet seasons became streets you could cross without ruining your sandals. And the calendar itself still carries his signature, quietly, the way a mason sometimes leaves initials on a stone nobody else will ever look at closely. A month took his name, August, sitting on the wall calendar beside July, which had taken the name of the adoptive father whose oath had once quietly changed, and whose title he now wore into a new age. The argument that built Rome, chapter by chapter, compromise by compromise, oath by oath, did not exactly end with him. It moved indoors. It settled into one household, one family, one line of succession, and there it stayed mostly for centuries. Still an argument underneath, in the way every household has its arguments, but conducted now behind closed doors, in a lowered voice, out of earshot of the Senate that had once shouted such things in the open air. Imagine, if you like, the Senate filing back into its old hall, taking their old seats in their old order, performing every gesture their fathers had performed, in a building that had not changed at all, for a republic that quietly had. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. The man who boasted he found Rome brick and left it marble lived, by choice, in the same modest house for 40 years, same rooms, same small bedroom, winter after winter. The most powerful person on earth kept the stage props of an ordinary citizen and slept, as far as we can tell, plainly. For about 2 centuries, something happened that had never quite happened before and has rarely happened since. Something like 50 million people, farmers, weavers, fishermen, potters, most of whom would live and die without ever laying eyes on the city of Rome itself, woke up each morning inside the same system. One currency in their coin pouches. One network of roads under their feet, or near enough. One body of law sitting somewhere behind every dispute over a debt or a boundary stone. Historians would later give this stretch of time a quiet Latin name, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and it is worth sitting with how strange a thing that peace was, not the peace of nothing happening. The peace of a machine running well enough that most people never had to think about it at all. Borders existed, far off, guarded by soldiers most citizens never saw. For the person selling bread in a market town in what is now southern France, or weaving wool in a hill town in what is now Turkey, the empire was not a map, it was water arriving. Aqueducts carried it for miles on stone arches, sometimes underground, sometimes striding across whole valleys on legs of cut rock, until it fell into public fountains and the private cisterns of anyone wealthy enough to pipe it further. Water simply came. That was the empire at the level where most people lived. In the city of Rome itself, the empire also meant bread, literally, as policy. A grain dole fed a significant share of the city's poor, month after month, a kind of public infrastructure built not from stone, but from wheat and shipping routes, and the political will to keep the crowd fed. It is easy at this distance to hear that as generosity. It was also, its architects understood, simply what kept a city of that size from tearing itself apart. Bread as plumbing, bread as one more system, quietly working. There was a postal system too, of a kind, an imperial post, built for government business, but astonishing in its reach. Relay stations sat along the major roads at set intervals, each one stocked with fresh horses, and where needed, a bed for a courier to sleep before riding on. A message could leave one edge of the known world and arrive at the other, having crossed deserts, mountain passes, and river valleys, without ever leaving Roman road. A merchant, meanwhile, could make something like the same journey for trade rather than government, moving from the cold hills of Britain to the markets of Syria, and manage the entire way with one language of commerce and one set of coins in his purse. Different faces, different gods worshipped along the roadside, different weather entirely, and yet the same denarius passing from hand to hand the whole way. Underneath the roads and the water and the grain, ordinary life simply hummed along, the way ordinary life does. Markets opened and closed. Contracts were signed, disputed, occasionally forged. Parents complained about school fees because there were school fees and teachers who expected them on time. Neighbors argued over shared walls. None of this made it into the history written centuries later about generals and emperors, because none of it seemed, at the time, like history. It seemed like Tuesday. And that, more than any triumph or monument, may have been Rome's quietest and most remarkable achievement. Not that it conquered so much ground, but that across so much ground, for so long, things simply worked, and people were free to spend their days worrying about small things instead of large ones. Imagine, if you like, a market stall at the edge of the empire, far from any senator's notice, doing a brisk trade in nothing more dramatic than pots and rope, entirely untroubled by the size of the thing it belonged to. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. At a fort on Rome's cold northern frontier in Britain, archaeologists found thin wooden tablets with soldiers' letters still legible upon them after nearly 2,000 years in the mud. In one, a soldier receives a care package from home, socks, and 2 pairs of underpants. Of everything the empire left behind, its most touching surviving document may be, in the end, simply a note that says, "It's cold up there. Dress warmly." Evening in Rome began, for anyone who could spare the time, at the baths. Not a quick errand, an occasion stretched over an hour or two, moving from hot rooms to cold pools and back again, skin pink from the heat, voices booming and echoing under high-vaulted ceilings built specifically, it seems, to make ordinary gossip sound magnificent. People came to get clean, but mostly, as far as we can tell, they came to talk. About business, about neighbors, about nothing at all, the way people do when the day's work is finally behind them and the water is warm. From the baths, if you had the means, you moved on to dinner, reclining on couches rather than sitting, because that was simply how a proper meal was taken, oil lamps throwing soft light across the table, honey, and a sharp fermented fish sauce turning up in dish after dish. On everything, the way certain sauces still do in certain households now. The food mattered less than the talk around it. Dinner in Rome was, more than anything, an excuse to keep several hours of conversation going, and the meal itself was almost a formality built to justify the sitting still. And then the lamps came on across the whole city, not all at once, but gradually, the way lights do, until a person looking down from a hill at night would have seen something close to what a person looking down from a hill sees now, windows glowing amber, floor after floor, up the sides of Rome's tall brick tenement buildings. Little clay oil lamps, thousands upon thousands of them, each one no bigger than a hand, each one somebody's small private decision to stay up a while longer. Moving through the dark streets below those windows were the vigiles, night watchmen, thousands of them across the city, whose job was not strictly to guard against thieves or troublemakers, though they did that too. Their real enemy, the one everyone in Rome quietly feared, was fire. The city was built largely of wood and packed close together, oil lamps burning in every room, and a single overturned lamp could take a whole neighborhood with it before dawn. So the vigiles padded through the alleys all night carrying buckets, wet blankets, and hand pumps, watching roof lines, sniffing for smoke, doing the unglamorous work of simply noticing trouble before it grew. The other thing moving through Rome's dark streets was noise, and this one had a very particular cause. Rome's daytime traffic had grown so thick that heavy delivery carts were banned from the streets during daylight hours entirely, a sensible fix for gridlock if you were a city planner thinking only about the daytime. What it meant in practice was that every cart that needed to move goods into or across the city had to do it after dark instead. So the carts rolled all night, iron-rimmed wheels grinding on stone paving, drivers shouting at each other over right-of-way, oxen groaning along under their loads, the whole apparatus of a city's supply chain rattling past bedroom windows until sunrise. One Roman writer, in a passage that happens to survive, grumbled that getting any sleep in Rome was nearly impossible, and that real quiet, the kind wealthy people paid for with a house far from the noise or a room deep inside a building, away from the street, cost a small fortune. It reads, honestly, almost exactly like something you might hear from someone living 3 floors above a busy road tonight. It may be, as far as anyone can tell, the first big city noise complaint on record, about traffic, filed 2,000 years ago and never, in truth, quite resolved since. Imagine, if you like, lying awake in a small room above a Roman street, oil lamp guttering out, listening to a cart's iron wheels pass below and thinking, as people have apparently always thought in cities after dark, that sleep would come eventually once the street settled down. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Rome solved its daytime gridlock by banishing delivery carts to the night, which meant the city's true soundtrack, the one nobody planned for, was iron wheels on stone paving until dawn. People complained they could not sleep. 2,000 years later, the sound of a city at night has barely changed at all, only the wheels are rubber now. There is a long afternoon we are not going to open tonight. The slow decline, the divided empire, the last Western emperor quietly set aside while the eastern half carried on for another 1,000 years, its lamps still lit. That is a file for another night, and a good one, but not this one. Tonight, at the end of such a long story, I would rather close on something gentler, something with less weather in it. Not how Rome fell, what it left sitting on the table, still warm, when it finally stood up from the argument and walked out of the room. Because the argument's furniture is still ours. Senates still sit, in more countries than Rome ever ruled, arguing over budgets and borders the way the old one argued over grain and provinces, the same low murmur of disagreement rolling on under a different roof. Vetoes still stop bills in their tracks, the same word, the same shrug of refusal, carried forward unchanged, syllable for syllable. Forums and capitals still carry Roman names for the simple reason that when people needed a word for a place where citizens gather to decide things, Rome's word was already sitting there, worn smooth by use, ready to be borrowed. Even the calendar keeps 2 rooms in Rome's house. 2 summer months still carry the names of Julius and Augustus, quietly, without announcement, the way a street keeps the name of whoever first laid its stones. Long after everyone walking it has forgotten why, or ever thought to ask. And the stone itself is still standing. Roman concrete, poured by hands that mixed volcanic ash into their mortar for reasons we are still only partly able to explain, has simply outlasted almost everything built with better tools since. The Pantheon's great dome, poured about 1900 years ago, remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome on this earth. It has no windows. Its only light is a round opening at the very top. The oculus opens straight to the sky, and through that one eye rain and moonlight have been falling onto the marble floor below for 19 centuries, landing in the same place, on the same stone, night after night, regardless of who was ruling anything at the time. Roads still run, in places, under highways that never bothered to move far from the original path, tarmac laid, quite literally, over the old paving stones. Law students, in lecture halls on the far side of the world from Rome, still learn small phrases of Latin because the law itself grew up speaking that language and never fully learned another, not completely. And underneath all of it, in the most ordinary way possible, our own mouths carry Rome's roads without our noticing: street, wall, wine, candle, small words for small things, worn smooth by 2,000 years of use, said 1,000 times a day by people who have never once thought about where the word came from, Roman the whole time. Rome did not vanish. That is, perhaps, the last thing worth saying about it. It dissolved into everything around it, the way an argument you win eventually stops being an argument at all, and simply becomes how things are done, so quietly absorbed into the ordinary that no one thinks to call it a victory anymore. It is just Tuesday. It is just a street name. It is just a dome with a hole in the top, and rain falling through it in the dark. Imagine, if you like, that dome tonight, the Pantheon, standing in a city that has changed everything around it many times over, its walls rebuilt, its neighbors renamed and renamed again, and still the dome holds its shape, the way it has held it since, before almost anything else standing nearby was built. Moonlight slides in through that one open eye, falling the last of its long way onto cool marble, landing where rain has landed for 1900 years, in no hurry at all. Somewhere outside, faintly, a city that Rome built the bones of goes on humming, all these centuries later, into another quiet night, the way it always does, the way it always has. That's where I'll close the file for tonight. The archive will be here tomorrow. It always is. Sleep well.